Welcome to another episode of Uncovered with Jarrod Kimber and Barrett Sundaresan, who's not here. I've given him the week off. He needs to be rested and rotated. For those who haven't read, he's put out a really good article about some of the racist treatment he's had in Australia, which I think he wrote for The Age. I don't think it's on Crit Post, but I'm sure if you go, I retweeted it, but I'm sure you can also find it via his Twitter account as well. But I've given him a rest, and he'll be back on next week. But essentially, I'm going to talk about exactly the same thing I was going to talk about with him, except with less Barrett than I would normally have. Because I just had like a sort of a laundry list of things that I wanted to talk about here. And the first one is the boundary catches. I'll probably make a video about this because there's a really interesting law quirk that does need to be, the best way of putting it needs to be discussed at the very least of what happened with that catch. But if you haven't seen the Michael Nisa catch, it's the catch where he gets a hand on the ball inside the boundary. He then jumps outside the boundary. And when he's outside the boundary, he gets off the ground, catches the ball, and then throws it up in the air, goes back in the ground and catches it. It's less so much about that. I will do a whole video about some of the interesting stuff. There's a lot of people who I think who are saying things like, well, nothing should happen outside the boundary in cricket games. And the most interesting thing about that is I don't think people have worked out how hard it is to actually work out if someone's over the boundary physically on a curved ground, which is massive. It's a big space. We don't have cameras all the way around the grounds anyway. So there is then the other argument, of course, that you should be able to take the ball, throw it up in the air, go outside the boundary, then come back in, and that's fine. And there's all these different ways of looking at it. But I think the most interesting thing is that those really good questions have come up, and really good discussions have come up on Twitter in some places about this particular catch. But the very basic thing is that this isn't a new catch. This has happened before, and that very few people actually understand that the laws have already been tweaked around these sorts of boundary catches. And the one thing that we see again and again in cricket is that so few people who play the sport, write about the sport, sometimes administrate the sport, watch the sport, actually know about the laws to begin with, and then also the playing conditions on the side of that as well. And it's something that I found very, very fascinating. And one of the reasons, of course, is that cricket laws are absolutely impenetrable is probably the wrong word, but complicated. They are written in not quite a legal way, but maybe more towards like a contract is written rather than the way that you would talk in an instruction manual, for instance. And I've been asking around some of my friends. I've been sending some messages to people I know, and these are people who don't work in the media, but big cricket fans. Some of which have played cricket for 30 and 40 years. Some absolutely obsessed with the game. It's incredible. I didn't get a person who got back to me who has actually read the law book from beginning to end, let alone the playing conditions as well. And it's something that, you hear commentary quite often. And I've read the law book. I probably don't read it as much as I should. It's one reason I love having Barrett on this podcast, which is would have been a good one for this particular topic, is because Barrett is an umpire, which is very, very rare amongst people who work in cricket. There's a lot of people who work in cricket who are players, but being an umpire is I don't know, he'd probably be one of the more younger umpires if I'd ever come across him in a game. Most of the umpires I've ever played with are, dads, granddads, who come to the game to help out, even in senior cricket, that come to get their glass of sherry and give a couple of dodgy LBWs. But it is one thing that I'm not saying that all other sports out there have a high percentage of people having read the playing conditions or, the rule books or the laws, depending on the sport that they have. But a lot of those other sports are a lot more simple to understand. And, when it comes to laws and playing conditions, ours is already complicated, and then no one is reading them either. Anyway, I'll do a full video on the Michael Nisa catch coming up because, as I said, I do think there's a weird little loophole, which I'm sure the MCC will be annoyed at for me even bringing up. But I do think it is worth looking at going ahead. But there's some other videos I've been working on as well. One of the others is on Chris Green, who is in the title of this video. Chris Green is a really, really fascinating player. I think Sambit Bal has just written a piece on Cricinfo today. I only got to read about half of it before I had to come up here and do this, but about the fact that T20 cricket, in order to survive, needs international cricket going ahead and bilaterals. I'm not sure it does, but it's a really interesting argument from Sambit. Looking at some numbers as well, and also looking at the way the cricket has grown, which is something I do believe in very strongly. The interesting thing is he talks about Trent Bolt. And he talks about Trent Bolt being people not getting massively upset when he decided to do what he did, which is a big change from what we've seen beforehand. Almost now the outcry when a player decides to put club over country is so small at this point that, it's barely makes a ripple. But there's a really other interesting player, I think, of recent times who is worth talking about, and that's Chris Green from Australia. Now, if you don't know who Chris Green is, that's okay. Very few people do. But one of the reasons I find Chris Green so fascinating is because Chris Green was a T20 player almost full all the way through. He's probably what I would refer to as a spoiler bowler. If you haven't seen him, he's an off spinner, kind of like a weird hybrid of something between Johan Botha and Sunil Narine. So he had a bit of Johan Botha's action, but also a little bit of his natural athleticism, but then used some of the skills of Sunil Narine as well. So, sort of an off spinner who doesn't just bowl off spin, and made his way as an opening spinner in Australian, a Big Bash originally. He's then played in Middlesex, played in the CPL. I think he played one game for KKR, played in the PSL a handful of games. So not a top level IPL, not a top level franchise player, but he's touched the top level and sort of in that middle tier, partly because he's probably not quite good as a batter consistently. Can hit the ball quite well, but not good as a batter consistently, but a very good fielder and a lovely person. Sometimes these people get talked up a little bit, but he's one of the person I hear the most positive stuff from people who work in cricket about. So the reason I'm bringing all this up is he's 29 and recently played his first and made his debut for New South Wales in first-class cricket. I think that was his first actual first-class game, although he might have played some red ball games just before that coming up that weren't scheduled as first-class games. It's a really interesting thing that hasn't been made a bigger story of, that you have this person who at the age of 29 was seen as almost completely a T20 player. Like, if you would have asked me, I would have assumed that, not that he'd made the decision not to play first-class cricket, because I think we've seen with a few of the T20 specialists, sometimes you just see where your skills are more valuable, and you go towards that. But I would have been very surprised if he would have changed his game in any way in order to play first-class cricket. And with Green, there's a lot of interesting things that happen around being in COVID, playing some club cricket in England, playing more with the red ball, and also when he started to play more with the red ball, he actually in his mind started to bowl better off spinners, and so that actually helped. But the truth is that we've seen so many situations in cricket where people are going away from red ball cricket, and here we have a totem in the other direction, a player who probably looked at his career and went, well, how am I going to maximize my earning? Perhaps I grew up in his case, and I'm pretty sure he did, wanting to be a first-class cricketer and actually going back to that. And we haven't heard really anyone talking about those sorts of things at all. This sort of reverse Malachi, to use a saying from from Happy Days, I think it is, but it's a very common phrase in Australia. But it is sort of, that's what it is, right? It's it's going the complete other direction. The salmon the ones who swim upstream. I didn't think I'd need Barrett here for salmon stuff, but again, it's just something that I think is worth having a look at. I think a lot of the talk about international cricket, first-class cricket, test cricket, franchises, what's happening, with the IPL owners is one movement, but there's actually going to be a lot of players who don't quite fit in at that top tier, right? And let's say the IPL owners buy all the franchise leagues in the world, which is, I suppose, a possibility. There might be some leagues that are held over, but at least the vast majority of them, they're going to want the very best players to be playing for them. And that makes sense. And, we'll expect to see more players like Trent Bolt and players develop like Dewald Brevis, right? Fine. But what about that second tier of players? If there is still money to be made from test cricket, from first-class cricket, from, list A cricket, internationals, bilaterals, all these other things, those players are still going to have to be there. And it's the one thing that I don't think is being talked about enough, which is that a professional cricketer is someone who has at best, probably 12-year earning window, right? There's the odd Brad Hodge story out there. And, obviously incredible players are going to start very young and probably finish into the late 30s. But most players, even above average talents, are probably going to have 12 years where they're at, sort of peak earning capability. These players are going to go where the money is. And sometimes the money isn't going to be necessarily where we think it's going to be. It's going to be in random positions. And I think Chris Green's case, it's maybe one of the first times we've seen that, but I don't think it'll be the only time we'll see situations like that. For instance, county teams still have money, right? And you still get paid, a good money to play first class cricket there. And obviously, Australia is another place that has that. But there will be other opportunities that will come up from that. Not to mention that there will be times when perhaps being an international player in one country is worth roughly the same amount of money as being a mid-range T20 player playing for all these different franchises around the world. That's the one thing that we don't really know what that next step is. But I do think that Chris Green and what he has done is a very, very interesting thing. But because he's not a hugely well-known cricketer, in fact, if you're busy Googling him at the moment, I don't blame you. Because he isn't that level of player, it doesn't get the kind of press, but also it is going against the narrative a little bit. And it's something I've been looking at for a little while. And I remember Chris Rogers, I think it was Chris Rogers, who was, when the Big Bash was on, went to New Zealand to play first class cricket. And I don't think he made a big amount of money from it. I would have thought that they probably paid his expenses and he maybe got a small stipend on top of that. But one of the reasons he did that is just because he wanted to keep himself in federal, from a first class and a test playing, area. These sorts of things are interesting, and it'll be, whether there is enough money to sustain them, and whether Chris Green comes in, plays a couple of games for New South Wales, then ends up taking a bunch of wickets in the Big Bash, and is a place in the PSL or the IPL, and he doesn't need those anymore. That's also a possibility. But the one thing that I have been talking about quite a lot, and I mentioned this not in this context, but quite across the board, is there's like 3,000 or 4,000 professional cricketers in the world. They're men cricketers, and then a few more hundred women now as well. They are all going to want and need jobs, and they are going to follow where the money is. The money won't always be where we think it will be, especially as this sort of capitalism and free market comes into the game. And it's a really interesting thing to watch going ahead. There are a lot of West Indian cricketers who probably make more money playing club cricket in America than they do playing in the CPL. There's a very, very interesting conversation to be had in the next 5 years to be able to work out all the different strands that professional cricketers have available to them. All right, I will play a quick ad, and then we'll come back. We'll talk a little bit about South Africa's batting. A couple of things about the Indian team as well, and the PCB coming up next on Uncovered.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
Is this live? Please hold up today's newspaper. Well, are we in the 1980s? Yeah, I probably won't be able to go back and get a newspaper. I'm trying to think of the last time I had a newspaper in my house. What else do we have? We have, I wanted to talk about the IPL and players being rested, potentially anyway, for India's World Cup campaign. I'm really interested to see how this plays out politically, because if I owned an IPL franchise, there's a part of me that thinks that my franchise is worth more money if India win major international tournaments. Like, I get that from an ownership perspective. I could see how if, let's say, India won, I don't know, 5 of the next 8 international tournaments, put in a Champions Trophy, shall we? T20, maybe the women win the Commonwealth Games, whatever it may be, World Cups, all those sorts of things. I would assume that if India had that kind of run, which we've never really seen from them, we've seen them have kind of similar runs over the last few years in bilaterals at times. They've never obviously done it when it comes to the silverware side of cricket. If they do get to a point where they can actually do that and suddenly start winning all those things, does that not help with the overall brand of the IPL and get you to a point, if you own an IPL franchise, where all of Indian cricket is worth more money, and so that therefore your team is worth more money? I can actually understand that argument. I haven't heard that one said publicly, but if I was chatting to an IPL owner, I would put that to them. But the other side is that I am paying players to play in my team. I played exorbitant fees. I am, at any stage, I have to, make sure that my team is the best that it can be. That's why I paid the money. I want the team to have as much success as possible, not just for my ego, but to build the brand of the franchise, especially early on in the franchise history, in the franchise history, especially some of those teams like Delhi, for instance, who haven't had that level of success. It's a really interesting concept of how this is going to work, because this is the reason at the moment that the 100 and the Big Bash are not involved with owners. There's other more technical reasons. I don't know if I've talked about this yet publicly, but the whole thing about the 100 being, I know IPL owners have talked to the ECB or teams directly about buying 100 teams. Lots of little problems. Okay, well, they get the oval there at that same time. So how does that actually work? Are they renting the facilities? Are they just using it for game days? How does training work? All these sorts of little things, which is fair. And we've already seen those sorts of things in the other times. And obviously the IPL has up everything. This is the first time we're almost did I go blank there? Sorry, everyone. This is almost the first time that we are seeing the opposite, which is the idea that the Indian team might be slightly more important. And I also wonder if this is partly because of there would be little blanks. I'll put it this way: I wonder if this is because India has been unsuccessful at the major tournaments for a little while now, which is a really interesting development considering how good they're initially. But also, it's just because it's a home World Cup. Like, is this something we wouldn't see if this World Cup was in or New Zealand or South Africa or wherever, right? It's really interesting thing if this happens. Let's say lose this World Cup and it doesn't actually work the way that they want it to. Is that? And then there's another World Cup coming up, and then there's a World Cup every 5 minutes. They kind of lose their meaning at a certain point, the phrase World Cup, when you've got so many of them. But hey, welcome to cricket. That's the interesting thing going forward, whether this is a one-off. Another thing is how many of those team owners will actually pull rank. I know, if I was working for one of those teams as an analyst, I would be thinking, nah, that's not what I want to be doing. So I'd be pushing really hard from that perspective. But the whole thing, I find it a really interesting topic. The other thing that came out when it was about the Indian team was that Hardik Pandya, and I think it was questioned on a wagon wheel last week, or I had it somewhere. So someone sent it to me anyway. About India backing this play. They've made this squad. I don't think it's as progressive as perhaps it could be when it comes to attacking and T20. I think India could have far more attacking and dynamic squads than they picked, but this is clearly a step in that sort of direction. And Hardik Pandya talked about them being backed. And I get that. And it makes a lot of sense. The thing is, I think the problem is that the Indian team necessarily has been too quick to drop people. There might be some players who are on the fringe who haven't been given the right opportunities, you sort of a Sanjay Samson type situation. But I don't think that the problem is that the young players haven't been backed. It's that it's the entire environment of Indian cricket makes it very hard for you to develop at the international level. And even for an IPL player, they're a big step up from being an international player or an IPL player being a top level international player. So the average national T20 cricket, and I'm talking about the top 12 or so teams who play. Is lower quality than once you get to that top 6, it's actually a big step up again. And I think from that, so the IPL sort of sits in this middle ground. But also when you for your IPL team, even if you're facing Rabada or going up against Rashid Khan or bowling to Andre Russell, you're still doing it in a way where it's a throwaway game. Those IPL games are almost by definition throwaway in that it happens on one night. 3 nights later, you get another game. And in between, some other young Indian player's done something good or bad or whatever. The difference with the international cricket and the way that Indians follow their international team, of course, is there's no games in between. And that narrative sticks, right? And once you fail as an Indian player, it's like it's the old death bowling thing. I've never ever written about a death bowler where I haven't praised them for being very good at what they're doing and had someone say, I can't believe you're praising them. I saw this person get hit for 25 runs, or this person always terrible when I turn on the TV. The truth is, if you're a bowler, balls in you being hit more than you've had dot balls. Boom, to a certain extent is part of that. And even Malinga has had times where he got run. Cameron might have hit not exactly than you're probably expecting me to say that. So from that perspective, in that's kind of the way that we look at death bowlers is very similar to the way that we look at Indian international players, and everything is kind of remembered a lot more, and it's all dramatized on both sides a lot more. And so you then have the place of where someone gets a really, really high end a star. They play a couple of games, everyone talks them up, and then they have a couple of poor games after that, and it all dips back down again, and suddenly they're the villain. That is the side of things I think is trickier, rather than what Hardik is talking about, which is the team backing those other players. I could see the Indian team. I don't see the and I would go back to even Virat Kohli and Ravi Shastri, even if I didn't agree with their T20 tactics or their limited overs tactics that much. I didn't see them as reactionary. I didn't see them as being bad for the players, but it's the entire structure. And I think that's the thing that's fun. Sorry if there's any problems with I have absolutely no idea what is going on with it at the moment. I think I'm just going in and out a little bit. I'm just going to have a quick break here. After the break, I will talk about. I want to talk about the PCB and the public splat. I suppose it is a splat at this point over there as well. But first, I have to find the ad.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
Beautiful. All right, so we'll go on uncovered here with Jarrod and Barrett Sundaresan. Available today. He's taking a knee. That's not. I suppose he just about racism. So maybe taking a knee is the right thing. He's on the bench. He's a super sub. He's an X Factor sub. Whatever you want to call it. He's got a week off, but he'll be back next week. I just want to talk briefly about the PCB public spat. So we talked before about the South African. And I should quickly talk about South African batters as well. But just on the PCB public spat, it's a really, really interesting thing if you haven't been following it. But the way that the Pakistani administrators, both past and present, are quite happily just launching into each other with graphics on Twitter, which are of one thing, leaks to the press, getting certain journalists who are friendly on either side. And I know there are actual politics involved in this as well, not just cricket politics. It does feel to me really seeing cricket administration become much more like a modern political fight. I can't think of too many other situations where I've seen those before. But yeah, it does. It is quite good, and seeing is everything going out and everything else. So it's quite remarkable situation. But it's not. I don't think any of this is that surprising because I suppose with Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, there's already a political element, more so than some of the other boards. Not that some of the other boards don't also have political elements as well, but more so than some of the other boards. And that is the way that modern politics is going. But to see a cricket administrator literally put up a a graph comparing their achievements with someone else's, and then another one leak out the amount of travel that the other person did or the cost of their travel that they did. It just feels very, modern politics. And we have seen the sort of backroom politicking before in cricket. And look, I've had BJP trolls be upset at me when I've upset them over whichever politician it was that is involved in cricket administration has said something wrong. So it's not that I'm, and to mention, Sri Lankan cricket, of course, where the sports minister has to sign off the team, right? Peter Chingoka in Zimbabwe was maybe the best one as well, as when it comes to political interference. But even then, it's just interesting the way that it's moved even more into a political type thing. It's, of course, for cricket, but it is very interesting to watch that power struggle play out in Pakistan from that perspective, and see how things go from there. And the other thing I just want to mention, so I'm doing a piece. There'll be a video up tomorrow on the 2022 review, which will also be up as a podcast a couple of days after that. I will be doing a video on the Nisa catch, and I'm doing something quite big on Chris Green as well, because I think it is a really interesting story. And the other one I've been looking at quite a bit is South African batters. And I think it becomes good when they have good for a very long time. It's funny how one player made a couple of major teams in their case, and suddenly England and Australia realize you can't bat, and things change a little bit in the narrative of how people start to talk about the team. When I think for a lot of us, we have seen for quite some period of time that this is a team that's been struggling. But the other interesting thing that I just wanted to mention, that I don't think many people really know that batting in different nations is very, very different. And I don't mean from a technical standpoint, which you all know, anyone who's on this channel is going to know, but just on a batting average point. Australia and India do seem to dominate the sort of batting legends conversation after World War II quite a fair bit. And they happen to be the places where the batters have the best averages, and not just the best players have the best average in Australia and New Zealand. Australia and India. Whereas South Africa and England, their batters have both been hit quite hard recently, talking about how they have poor batting lineups. Obviously, and England have managed to, pole vault themselves. But you see how the fact that playing in South Africa does lower overall batting average. Now, you grew up in those conditions, it shouldn't be as bad. Although all those markers, I think, are worth mentioning. But in a point of history where the batting average has dropped significantly, and quite significantly against farm bowling, and South Africa have a bad crop of players, it's very easy to say, well, they don't have any good batters, and I'm more than happy to agree that is true, because you look at their first class numbers and it's not the case. The tricky thing is, and I wrote about this when England were really struggling with the bat in Test cricket as well, is it's actually hard to tell how bad they are. It's not quite a simple arithmetic, because they already have depressed averages compared to some of the other nations. And then in those two particular cases, you're talking about something that affected batting in Test cricket predominantly against seam bowling, which in England and South Africa is, kind of the bread and butter bowl as well. So it's a really interesting thing when we're talking about South African batters, of trying to work out how bad they actually are compared to the other batting lineups in the world. I mean, it does feel very Dean Elgar a bust all time. So I think that's fair. I've got about another 10 minutes left that I could chat. So if anyone is on YouTube at the moment and wants to ask any questions, feel free to ask them. I see that a couple have come in. So I'll answer one from Avi. And then if anyone else wants to put one below, I'll see if I can get to that. Avi says, South Africa will leave behind the 100, the BBL and the PSL. So I understand the thought process behind this, but I'm not sure that that is 100% true because they're never going to be able to make that much money from the market. And if they don't have in players in a particular market, and they might, of course, but even if that was the case, if the fact that the IPL owners have already made conversations with English cricket, even though it's not for sale, tells you that if the IPL owners ever got their hands on the 100 or teams in the 100, it would be a far bigger league. So at the moment, at the SA20 might have a bit of an advantage because of the players that it's got there. But in the long run, when you look at the audiences and what you can charge fans for shirts, all those sorts of things, and how much advertising they'll be able to get on all those sorts of things. Realistically, it's not true. And what doing is, I think that the more important more from the IP owners, buying big stakes is the league in the USA for the same reason that which like the soccer league, football leagues were everywhere, right? Including on North America and South America, or Central America and South America, so in similar time zones. And yet, I think the per year Major League Soccer is worth $250 million. Major League Cricket is going up against a bunch of leagues that, the 100 is very, very new. Even these older leagues like, the CPL and the Big Bash and the PSL are actually reasonably new. So I would have thought that the bigger league, it's funny that you haven't mentioned the Major League. The Major League could be the one that has the bigger bounce than South African League anyway, from that perspective, just there's more money. The South African League is going to be a subordinate league, whereas the PSL is going to be interesting because that really depends on what Pakistan's future is as a sport watching country, as much as a country itself and everything else. Big Bash, I don't know. I kind of feel that the Big Bash will be the last of the major leagues that doesn't have private owners. Everything I've heard about English cricket is that there's very big chance that it will. Saying it's going to happen in the next 5 years. Compared to the conversation I've heard, I feel there are more of a movement towards in the UK than there is in Australia. But yeah, just because of the markets and everything else, I don't really believe that the South Africa will leave behind those other leagues. It might in the short term, but in the long term, I just can't imagine it will. Thanks, Abby. Let's see anything else. Oh, sorry, I meant to press show there. Oh, I've completely lost this one. Oh, Abby, sorry, didn't mean to do that, everyone. No workload management in the IPL. We want them to play all matches. See, I think this is the other thing. If we get to a point where players are rested at this stage in the IPL, again, I'm thinking as an owner, because they're the most important people in this particular phrase outside of the fans. But if you think about it as an owner, one of the things of bilateral cricket the last couple of years that hasn't worked as well is players resting. And this is not just a thing in cricket, of course. The perennial conversation in basketball is about load management. Occasionally it comes up question in other sports as well. But yeah, from that perspective, do you really want it to be a league that has that problem now? Eventually, the IPL will have a load management resting rotation for a couple of reasons. As I think fast bowlers will play game on baseball pitches. But the other reason that eventually the IPL will get to a point where we will have 30, 40, 50 games a year. Maybe not that many, but so they'll go over 20 and they'll go over 25. And, who knows how far the IPL can move. At that point, players will start to get rested a lot more. Why if you owned a franchise now, would you want to rest it? And why would you want it to be like international cricket where, your best players are not available in every game? I can't imagine that if I was an owner, that is something I would like. And from a fan perspective as well, like there are a lot of people now who are caught up in IPL in a way that they think IPL is their major form of cricket. And the IPL kind of sells itself that way, right? And it's a Very, very interesting thing going ahead. Now, if you then do about face everything there, and you start to say, actually, the Indian international team is more important. That's it divides, and from a brand and marketing point of view, it's a really, really interesting issue. So I think some owners might do it and some owners might not, but it'd be really interesting to see how it plays out in the season itself. Success Folk says, did you talk about Baba's declaration? I haven't, actually. I should have been on my notes, actually, because I wanted to write a piece on it, maybe even do a video on it, but the moment has passed here. I look at it in a different way than other people did, in that maybe because I watch more first-class cricket than most people, but to me, it had the very strong feeling of a first-class cricket declaration. And I don't know how many people still watch first-class cricket, but if you watch first-class cricket and Test cricket, and I've always said this, first-class cricket is so much more exciting sometimes, just because generally, yeah, the one less day, so 2 less days, I suppose, in the old days, and it meant that teams had to factor in things like declarations and strategy and how quick you batted. All those sorts of things were a big part of it. And, you see things like New South Wales played Victoria one time. I can't remember how many runs Victoria needed on the last day, but I feel like it was close to 500 runs in the. And Victoria just went with it, because if Victoria lost that first-class game, it's just another first-class game and they're going to play another one in the next week. And B, they were miles behind anyway, and they were going to have to bat for whatever it was, best part of it. And us, I think, made double 100, absolutely slaughtered the New South Wales in that game, and Victoria won. That's not a one-off, right? You see that a lot. And on top of that, you see a lot more contrived results as well, where sort of the two captains get together and they're like, look, you need a win, I need a win. What can we do here? And so from that perspective, I kind of thought that that's what Bubba was doing. And what I wondered was whether this was the first class kind of declaration that we've seen in the World Test Championship. And I didn't want to go back through all the old ones, but I did wonder if it was, now that it's about points a little bit more and it's about individual games, and they still had a chance at that stage of qualifying for the final, however distant and almost impossible. I did wonder if that was the situation that was there, where essentially they were looking at it from that from perspective of, well, it's going to be a draw, we'll get this amount of points, maybe we can do that. The other thing I thought was from the anti, and most people were on the other side of that declaration, which is absolutely fine. I did find it interesting that Pakistan's tail weren't having, or tail or middle order, whatever you want, trouble on that pitch, and that Bubba kind of assumed that the New Zealanders would. And I think we saw, obviously, that they were going to go a lot harder, get very hard at the ball. And I did think to myself that it was old-fashioned Test cricket. I could actually almost have seen why Bubba would have done that, because in those days, the way that players hit was a little bit more dangerous. Batting, and it goes back to the way England in Test cricket now, England bat in one-day cricket. We don't talk about this a lot, but if you get a chance to watch any highlights of games from the 80s and 90s of old games, have a look at the way they batted in the death. When players put their foot down to swing in those days, half the players just went wicket and were swinging across the line. The rest were probably playing dead straight. No one really could hit over cut unless you were, Indad, or perhaps, Damien Martin. It was really, really rare. Ravi Shastri was maybe another one. There weren't that many players who could over the offside at all at that point. Hitting boundaries to backward point and opening the face, all these sorts of things didn't exist. Bubba should have known of all that, of course, but it was really interesting to me that he was thinking they're going to come out and they're going to swing really hard, and that'll give us a chance. And look, we're not that far away from Sydney Thunder being bowled out for 15, so fair play to him from that perspective. But it was really noticeable mentioning someone like Conway, who has a really good strike rate in T20 cricket, how safe he bats when doing that. And I think that again, it made Bubba's declaration just not make as much sense because of how quickly and how safely people could score now. It's it's not as reckless as it once was. Perhaps in the you get a couple because the ball was keeping a little. You get a couple of people swinging the line, and suddenly you've got a big chance of the game. It was interesting. Obviously, I didn't really, unless it was purely an idea of we can bowl them out in 8 overs and they're going to slog across the line. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. But the one thing I was thinking about, was maybe the World Test Championship could actually kick drive Test cricket to be that slightly more aggressive frame of mind from everyone. But yeah, I that he did it from a. I think the more interesting things we see in Test cricket, even the failures, that that format of the game has to evolve as well. And if you look at probably everything, the wobble ball, the way England's played, and even the World Test Championship, as massively flawed as it is, I think interesting things in Test cricket, perhaps that happened a while back. Himet says, your thought on expanding cricket like soccer and making it with associate nations, because big cricket countries play associate nations only in ICC events. Look, I think the last, 3 or 4 years, had the one-day league. You saw a lot more cricket being played. Ireland beat South Africa at home in a match. They then went to the West Indies and won that series. You saw Netherlands really developing their cricketers against the best players in the world. Great idea. And I would obviously love to. When you're talking about, like soccer, that really what soccer does, though, right? So soccer has very few friendlies. And what we have in cricket is actual cricket. And it doesn't necessarily give us enough time for them. Plus, those boards are desperate to get as much money as possible. In soccer nations or a situation where they are already making the vast majority of their money from leagues. That's not the case in cricket yet. Outside the IPL, these leagues are just not making anywhere near as much money as boards thought they were going to make. So it's a great idea, and obviously I love it when it happens, but I don't see how that's going to happen with your major teams playing anytime soon from that perspective. And I just got a couple of other quick questions that we'll finish up with. Avi says, I don't think the World Test Championship is here to stay with domestic T20 leagues getting bigger and bigger. I don't think there's any reason to get rid of it, though, until, tests completely drop off. At the moment, I think Sri Lanka and we're playing 5 tests in a 5-year period. That's enough to continue the World Test Championship realistically. Whether it's here to stay or not, it's more a question of whether, the majority of Test cricket is here to stay or not. I don't know if you're listening from the top of the episode, Abby. I still think there's money to make, and I think it is. I think there'll be a lot of players. I think what we might get is definitely amongst the best leagues in the world. There'll be a lot of very good players out there looking for other paydays, and as we saw with Chris Green, they might follow the money. I don't think the money is always going to be in T20 leagues because at the moment there's only one massively profitable T20 league. And even in these other ones, they might be feeder leagues, but will owners be happy to pay players $2 million to play for the Barbados Royals? Probably not, right? And so there will be other ways for players to make money going ahead. Last question. Jake says, would you drop Nichols for Young? Nichols seems to be becoming the weak link in a strong New Zealand batting lineup. Nichols is a fascinating cricketer to me. If you go back, Jake, and I think it's the first most improved players series. So when I must have done that, 2020 must have been. It's in the middle of the year. It was the first long video essay I ever did, in fact. And many people hated Nichols because he plays on my mind. In fact, I think going in, probably like someone I thought would win the award. And then you have a look at it, and he's just had this bizarre career of periods in time where he cannot score a run at all, and periods of time where he looks like one of the world's best players. And a lot of it seems to be about how well he's played off spin at times. There was a period where he was off spin. It was against good off spin as well, and it wasn't just in New Zealand or anything like that. And then there was a period where he was averaging, I want to say 8 against off spin for like a year or something. It was like made up numbers, truly bizarre numbers. And I think I've written about him a few times. Look, I think he's a fantastic player. I like Young. They're doing this really interesting thing of like Young and Mitchell, where, and I don't know what this is to do with the development of cricket, but you could kind of Young and Mitchell into like all these different spots. It's almost like they're coming up with ideal backup batters or utility batters. I mean, that's a very Aussie rules football phrase, but you know, the idea that they could kind of, you could kind of see someone like Young batting anywhere from one. I wonder if there's, he's a good player, but I wonder if he's as comfortable batting in the middle order. I'd have to, you know, deep dive through his class numbers and everything else to have a look at that. But yeah, I like Young a lot. I'm not sure he's better than Nichols, I suppose, is one thing I'm trying to say. And I think that, you know, with Mitchell, I think that with Mitchell and Young, I think they're very, very good sort of as your, maybe your backup opener or your number 5 or 6, or maybe number 6, maybe. And I wonder if they will be good enough home and away over a long period of time to play in those more key positions, which is what they're asking Nichols to do. And maybe that's part of the other problem, of course, is okay, I like it. So problem with that. I'll just do, oh no, I don't need to do that one. Yeah, just 2 quick ones at the end. The Outcast says, what do you think of the selection of Mukesh Kumar in the T20 international squad despite not playing any IPL games? Is it because of injury? Well, it's partly because of injury, but I think they're trying to see him out. I've got no problem with that because you shouldn't just be picking people based on one competition anyway. They should be having a look at them. By the time you see someone in the IPL, you should have a real idea of what kind of player they are anyway. And I don't know what Indians, you know, scouting / selection is like from a professional level these days, but I've got no problem with it kind of happening in both cases where a player doesn't play any other professional cricket and then plays in the IPL and gets picked for India. And also the other way, because there's a lot of different information to be able to know. I think it would be great for him to play some IPL cricket because that will help develop. It's not, you know, playing for India and learning for India is a very harsh way of developing a player. But if they think that there's something there, then get them in the side and have a look at them, especially in this kind of a squad, which is a development squad. And just the last one on Virat Kohli, because why not? Ashwani says, do you think Virat gets amongst Fab 4? There's a period of time for 2 or 3 years. I'm pretty sure he was averaging a lot of them against, and that was playing it also in India for a good percentage of time, whereas the other 3 both all have the advantages of playing a lot of spin in unfriendly spin conditions. I would say that I think Joe Root is the best player of spin in that group, and I would have thought Virat Kohli is the second best player of spin. Now, last couple of years, he struggled against spin base. So you may be looking at the overall arc of his career. But I'd be shocked if that was the case, that he was the... I like Kane Williamson against spin. I like Steve Smith against spin. I think Virat and Joe Root are a step above. Joe Root is incredible against spin. And, you know, I know we've talked about it a little bit before, and I've probably done a video about it. But yeah, he, you know, there's no doubt there that he's a fantastic player of spin. I think I have him as number 1. But it is tricky just because, you know, playing spin when the majority of your time is not in Asia is absolutely nothing like playing spin when the majority of the time is in Asia. Very, very, very different. And I'd be, you know, if you could do some sort of experiment, who's the best player of spin, I'd be shocked if it wasn't very close to Joe Root, but certainly slightly above Kane Williamson and Smith. Not that I think any of those 4 players are bad against spin. In fact, it's I think it's a really interesting thing if you go through, especially post-war batters, but this is probably the case if you go back even before the war. I think there are probably a lot of players who are good against pace or good against spin. And when you're looking at the greatest players of all time, you're probably looking at them as being average or above average against one of those disciplines, and then well above average against the other one. And I think that's probably, it's very rare to see a player who's absolutely brilliant against pace and absolutely brilliant against spin, because they are anyone who's ever played cricket will tell you when you're sitting there at the just completely different ways of playing a game. Anyway, huge thank you to everyone who popped up. I know it was a rip time. Barrett wasn't here and everything else, but we will be recording more of these sorts of things live, and they will sort of pop up. And obviously, if you follow me on Twitter now, you can watch them there, and if not, you can always follow them on YouTube. But this podcast will be up tomorrow on you came in late and you missed some of it, you'll be able to see it there. But huge thanks to everyone. Sorry, there was some technical difficulties today. Don't know what's going on there. But huge thanks to everyone. As I said, I've got some videos on South African. There's a review of 2022 coming up. South African batters is something I'm mucking around with. The Nisa catch, Chris Green, and the IPL review, which I've actually done, but I'm not sure if Muku's got that ready just yet to be going up, but perhaps probably does. But that's going up in a couple of days. We just pushed that back because of the year in review. We wanted to put up a little bit quicker because the year just finished and the IPL doesn't start for a little while. But huge thanks to everyone, and I will see you again on the many different places that you can see me next time.
There is something wrong in the cricket world, and while it may not be a conspiracy, there does seem to be a movement towards leaving more grass on the wicket, and thusly, the global batting average has dropped. If a similar thing has happened to you in your personal life, try Manscaped. Their Lawnmower 4.0 will help you trim any unwanted pubic grass. And once your downstairs track is taken care of, you can also use Manscaped's liquid formulations. So before heading outside, use the Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant to stay cool in the heat. And if you've been playing too many games recently and you need some help with your strip, why don't you go and get their Crop Reviver? I think I may possibly have taken all of this analogy too far. But the point is, Manscaped sells items that allow you to shave your pubic itch pitch. Use the code REDINKA, all one word, which is the name of my podcast, and you can get a 20% discount and free worldwide shipping while you curate your special strip like a team of sweaty men hoping it doesn't rain.
Bye.